Personally, I believe that it's easier to use a technique if you understand how it works. This is why whenever I teach someone to drive a manual car, I always make sure that they understand what's happening when you move the gear shift and what the clutch actually does. And so, while I'm certainly not a cognitive scientist, I want to give you a very basic explanation of how your memory works. This is important because it'll help you understand why we do some of the strange things that we're going to do throughout this course. It's all linked to the actual inner workings of your mind, and it's all based on neuroscientific research. So first and foremost, let me say that your mind is made up of about 100 billion tiny little cells called neurons. These are basically electrically excitable cells that process and transmit information using electrochemical signals. These signals are a lot like the electrical signals firing between different parts of your computer, except in your brain there are no wires. Instead, we have synapses, and those are specialized connections between the neurons. I don't want to get too technical here because this stuff is definitely over my head, and in fact, the way our memory works is not yet fully understood, even by leading cognitive scientists. But basically, memories are created when your brain sends neurotransmitter signals to two neurons at the same time. This strengthens the connection between those two neurons, and presto, you have a new memory. This is an important point to make because it shows that the creation of memories requires connection between two neurons, or a connection to existing neurons in your brain. The other thing you need to know is that when this happens over and over again, the cluster of neurons and their synaptic connections become something called a neural network. From artificial intelligence research, we know that neurons work better in these types of clusters. This means that when several neurons fire together, the signal is actually amplified. That's why it's so crucial to store memories in several connected neurons and to further connect them to the memories that we often use. Now, this is where it gets really important. Your brain has these two incredibly powerful parts called hippocampi, interestingly named for the fact that they look like little seahorses. You have one hippocampus for each hemisphere that, among other things, regulates how memories are created. As far as we're concerned, the most important function of these hippocampi is to determine what's worth remembering. There are a lot of criteria here, including novelty, but perhaps one of the most important criteria for the hippocampi is to determine that something is relevant based on existing memories in our brains. The net effect of this, as we hinted before, is that the more connections there are to a piece of information, the more likely your hippocampi are to determine that it's worth storing. But what about forgetting things over time? Well, our brains have a capacity of about 2.5 petabytes. That's plenty of room for all of the things we want to superlearn. So why does it seem like we're constantly forgetting things? Well, as researchers have recently found, our brains actively forget memories in order to remain efficient and healthy. Our brains, though they're only 2% of our body mass, take up 20% of our energy consumption. So keeping them efficient is a huge evolutionary advantage for our bodies. In fact, forgetting irrelevant information is so important that there are numerous mechanisms in the brain used to forget things based on whether it determines it should be forgotten because of trauma or just because it's not useful. In some of these processes, the hippocampi are at play again, and they're always searching for relevance and applicability. At the end of the day, this means that having many connections to our memories has another massive benefit. It makes it less likely for them to be removed or to fade away. To give you a metaphor of this, I want you to imagine two roads. One is a 6-lane highway connecting 8 medium-sized towns, and another one is a country road connecting one house to another. Now imagine that the state budget only has room to repair and maintain some of these roads, not all of them. Which road is more likely to receive regular maintenance and improvements? Which is more likely to be neglected and erode away? This, for example, is why you rarely forget information like your childhood address, even if you haven't used it for years and years. Because there are so many connections and stories and experiences around that piece of information, your brain determines that it's critical and will never erode it away. Knowing this can benefit us tremendously. The process of superlearning necessitates that we create more connections to the information we want to learn. This way, the mind is forced to remember it like we would remember everyday information that we use. Think about how children learn. For example, they pick up a spoon and they play with it time and time again. They eat with it, they drop it on the floor. All the while, they're building connections and an understanding and a history around that spoon, what it does, how it feels. Finally, they learn to remember the sound, the name for it, spoon. This is also why writing things down or any type of mnemonic, even the basic ones, is a useful tactic for learning. You see, you're simply creating new memories in the form of stories or sentences and tying new information like the order of operations, first, outer, inner, last, in mathematics, to a word that you already know, foil. But what about in the adult brain? Of course, there are different requirements for adults to learn than for children, right? Well, first and foremost, I want to dispel the myth that children's brains are somehow better at absorbing new information or that they have a higher neuroplasticity. Recent studies have actually shown that this is simply not true. The reason that children seem to learn with more ease is that they're learning literally every waking hour, and all information is new and exciting information for them. Furthermore, research shows that our brains do play by the use it or lose it rule. Most adults lose the ability to learn rapidly simply because they settle into their day job and they stop learning in the volume that they used to as children, not because their brain chemistry or neuroplasticity have actually changed. With that said, there are definitely some requirements that are unique to adult learners. In fact, in the 1950s, one of the leading researchers in adult education, Malcolm Knowles, published a book around the 5 requirements for adult learning. Now that we understand how the brain works a little bit, I don't think any of them will surprise you. They are, number 1, self-concept. Adults are self-directed and independent. They need to take an active role in creating their learning experience. Number 2, the role of experience. Adults have a growing reservoir of experience, including mistakes, that is a critical resource for their learning. Number 3, readiness to learn. Adults are most ready to learn things that are pertinent to their daily life situations. Number 4, orientation to learning. Adults respond best to learning that will be immediately applicable. Adults are more problem-centered than subject-centered in their learning. And number 5, motivation to learn. For adults, the motivation to learn is internal. This means that they must know why they need to learn this new information. So, do you understand why we've done some of the things we've done in the last few lectures? Explaining why you need to know things, making you set your own goals and schedule your own learning sessions. In general, you can leave it up to us as your instructors to make sure that this course follows along with all 5 requirements for adult andragogy, as well as to conform to the formula that best suits your very picky hippocampi. But, as we said before, we can go far beyond this. Beyond just setting up the materials in a way that's interesting to you and your brain, we can actually build synaptic connections or memories in a much more efficient and rich way. And that is what we're going to be learning in the next lectures. But first, make sure to check out the PDF syllabus because there's a good amount of homework and a ton of optional reading materials on everything we've learned in this lecture.